Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Evaristo Mapedza, and together with colleagues, Kofi Arnon, who is the IASC Executive Council member, and also with Grace Rusnamodzi, we sort of organizing with Grace leading in the organization of these webinar series. The objective of this series is that we have a dialogue and conversation, sharing of experiences and research, and also to help catalyze some discussions around the different common thematic areas. And today we are quite happy to have Assistant Professor Praneeta Mudaliar from the University of Toronto. And she's going to be presenting on power dynamics in Lake Victoria fisheries. And I will also ask you that before she begins, she could also say more about herself as some form of introduction before moving on to your presentation, which is scheduled for about 30 to 35 minutes. And thereafter, we have a conversation, discussion, comments, or any other issues that colleagues might have. I would encourage all colleagues, maybe if you have a question as she's presenting, please do note that in the chat. So we'll start with those questions when we come to comments and discussions. And Praneeta, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Grace, Evaristo, and Kofi, for inviting me to the IASC Africa Commons Dialogue. I'm very excited to present my research here with you all and have a discussion. Let's see. So, is it visible, my slides?
Yes, visible. If you just add them in the presentation mode. Okay. Yes, perfect.
All right, okay. So as Evaristo mentioned, I'm presenting on power dynamics in Lake Victoria's polycentric fisheries. And for the next 30 to 35 minutes, I'll introduce myself as well as the topic of today's webinar, a little bit of literature review, the framework that I used for analysis, the methods, results and discussion, and conclusion. So a little bit about myself. So my name is Praneeta Mudaliar. I'm an Assistant Professor of Natural Resources Policy and Stewardship at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And before this, I was an Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies and Science in Ithaca College in New York. And my research interests are quite diverse. I started with water governance, which continues to be an interest today as well, where I investigated caste dynamics in India and racial dynamics in the US and how those affect how decisions are made for watershed governance. I then had a fantastic opportunity to study fisheries governance in East Africa, on which I'll be presenting today. More recently, I've started studying youth advocacy for climate justice, how young people advocate for climate justice, and I'm really interested in studying what youth activism looks like in the global south. I have some other projects on heat and climate action planning in India and the US, and some smaller projects on land and forest conservation. This was a recent project on sacred natural groves and how they exclude women from participating in the management and decision making for sacred grove governance. The research that I'll present today on power dynamics in Lake Victoria's fisheries, I got this opportunity when I was a postdoctoral fellow in environmental justice and sustainability at the University of Denver. And I had to knock a lot of doors to be able to get this opportunity. So after talking to a lot of faculty, I finally was able to be a part of this project, which was funded by the National Science Foundation in Lake Victoria's fisheries. And this was a massive 5-year project with natural scientists and social scientists. And there was no one studying the governance aspects of Lake Victoria, which is why I got this chance to bring in my expertise in governance. And through that, I could carve a small portion of the project to study the power dynamics in this kind of a polycentric system. And through that, I could do fieldwork in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And my research there was supported by the Kenya Marine Fisheries Research Institute, the Tanzania Fisheries Research Institute, and the Lake Victoria Fisheries Organization. So with that introduction, I'll dive into the topic for today. Okay. So as most of y'all will be knowing, Lake Victoria is shared by 3 countries, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And from the 1990s through the 2000s, all of these countries adopted fisheries co-management to facilitate power sharing between the government and fisher folks. And these co-management reforms, they occurred in a context of devolution, giving rise to multiple independent overlapping decision centers across different levels of governance. So this includes the central and local governments, the fisheries officers in these different governments, and then the co-management institutions called as the beach management units, which include both fishers as well as the government officers who are coordinating with each other to manage the lake's fisheries. So this kind of a semi-autonomous coordinating decision centers with overlapping authority at the different levels of governance, they correspond to a polycentric system. So co-management was expected to improve fisheries management and outcomes by involving fishers in fisheries management. But that is not how it has panned out. And a lot of people have done research on the challenges of co-management of Lake Victoria's fisheries. So some of the challenges that have involved include this very top-down approach to co-management. For instance, in Uganda, the army took over fisheries in Jan of 2018. On 1st January, actually, Tanzania's government started Operation Sangara, which is a crackdown on illegal fishing by seizing and burning the illegal fishing gear that took all the lower level decision centers by surprise. So with that context, I was interested in the research question of how these power dynamics between the central, the local governments and the BMUs, how do they influence the structure and functionality of a polycentric system? And I'll define a polycentric system. So polycentric systems are these multiple overlapping nested decision centers across jurisdictions that can theoretically create opportunities for actors across these multiple levels to self-organize for initiating and implementing solutions to address very complex socio-ecological issues. So, and through this kind of self-organization, these actors, it can lead to social learning, it can lead to improved social capital, coordination of initiatives, resource mobilization to facilitate informed decision making for improving social and environmental outcomes. But this self-organization, it depends on power and its distribution among the institutions and actors. So examining where power is concentrated, who holds power, how that power is wielded is important because it involves so many different state and non-state actors who may have different interests, different worldviews, different beliefs, different knowledge, oversights, as well as resources. And power dynamics as a concept has been not examined in polycentric systems, like under what circumstances do they matter and what kinds of power dynamics matter, those things are unknown. So to explore how power dynamics influence the structure and functionality of a polycentric system, I could conduct empirical fieldwork across Lake Victoria's fisheries. So my framework comes from, one part of my framework comes from Morrison et al.'s polycentric power typology, which draws attention to both formal as well as informal power dynamics among multiple centers. And Morrison defines power as this uneven capacity of different actors to influence goals and processes and well as outcomes. So Morrison et al. Say that there are 3 types of power. So one is power by design, then there's pragmatic power, and then there's framing power. So power by design is power that is visibly written into the rules and legislation. So it's written into the design of governance. It's the ability of actors, state actors, to independently legislate, create formal rules, distribute resources, design policy, markets, and incentives. So it focuses on these structural features, and you can examine power by design by studying the institutional arrangements, such as all the written documents of policies and agreements, laws, strategies, and incentives, to understand how authoritative power is officially designed and formally distributed within a system. So these can include how decision centers and actors may interact with each other to share information, to identify solutions, and to coordinate and incentivize problem solving. The next type of power is pragmatic power. So this kind of power examines how the decision makers might have the discretion to implement the rules based on what is written. So this can include that, okay, they're interpreting the rules the way they're written, or it can be false compliance, where maybe they pretend to implement the rules, but they don't actually implement the rules. It can be feigned ignorance, like pretending you don't know what the rules are. It can be tokenistic behavior. It can be non-decision making or an inability and reluctance of government to implement policies, and just a general lack of compliance. So this kind of pragmatic power is revealed. It's the link between the institutions and the actions, and it's revealed through interviews and observations, surveys, ethnographies, and immersive research. And finally, there is framing power, which illustrates how actors construct discourses and frames to influence others through rational as well as manipulative persuasion, inducement, or sanction or coercion. So the kinds of narratives that are constructed in order for people to conduct any kind of illegitimate behavior, or to subvert, disrupt, and avoid formal rules and regulations in order to move their agenda forward. So this can include things like lobbying or rent seeking or patronage. So with this polycentric power typology, my next step was to understand how to map the polycentric power typology to the polycentric, to how we identify a polycentric system. So Carlyle and Gruby, in their paper in Policy Studies Journal, they identified two attributes of polycentric systems as well as some enabling conditions. So I mapped the polycentric power typology by Morrison et al. To Carlyle and Gruby's framework for understanding polycentric systems. So this framework has two attributes. So one is that for a system to be considered as polycentric, it should have multiple overlapping decision centers with some degree of autonomy. So they should be semi-independent. And the enabling conditions over there are that these decision centers should employ diverse institutions. So there should be a variety of institutions, not just one type of institution. And they should exist at different levels across different political jurisdictions. And so that part, attribute one, focuses more on the structural aspect of a polycentric system. And attribute two says that these decision centers can choose to act in ways that take account of others through cooperation, competition, and conflict resolution. So this is the functional aspect of polycentric systems. So the enabling conditions here include rules and norms that structure actions and behaviors to incentivize experimentation. Decision centers participate in cross-scale linkages. And then there are mechanisms for accountability and conflict resolution. So this is a framework that I combined in order to analyze the data that I collected during my fieldwork. So for my methods, I adopted a case study approach to conduct an in-depth investigation of the power dynamics in Lake Victoria's fisheries. So in total, I had 108 in that semi-structured interviews between 2017 to 2018. And these interviews included state and county fisheries officers from all three countries, the principal secretaries of fisheries at the ministries, fisher groups, as well as individual fishers from the beach management units, as well as scientists from the three fisheries research institutes. I conducted snowball sampling in order to access these different interviews, and snowball sampling provided access to these visible but also hard to recruit fisheries officers, right from Jinja and Kampala in Uganda, Kisumu and Nairobi in Kenya, and Mwanza and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And I used the same semi-structured interview questionnaire as a starting point for all the interviews, and which also allowed for probing of very specific topics depending on the expertise of the interviews. And you'll find the interview questionnaire in the paper that was published from this research in Environmental Policy and Governance. The questionnaire is attached to the, it's available in the appendix of the paper. So during these interviews, I had a chance, some of them went up to 60 to 90 minutes. And through this, I could explore the powers of actors, how they interpret their roles, their activities, their responsibilities, how do they implement the rules, the constraints in implementing the rules, the challenges, the cross-level linkages for sharing information, accountability, and conflict reducing mechanisms. Mostly, I could conduct the interviews in English. For fishers, the interviews were translated with the help of research assistants from the different fisheries research institutions in Swahili and Luganda. I also could conduct 6 focus group discussions with fishers, 2 FGDs with BMUs in Kenya, 1 in Tanzania, and 3 in Uganda. And then finally, I could also include documents such as the fisheries regulations for different countries, as well as the BMU guidelines to triangulate this data. After that, I developed a code book with the code name, definition, and example. And through deductive coding, I coded the data to the 3 aspects of the polycentric power typology, as well as the attributes and enabling conditions of the polycentric systems. So now coming to the results. So I applied this polycentric power typology to examine power by design, pragmatic power, and framing power across the attributes and enabling conditions for Lake Victoria's fisheries in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. So I'll start with Kenya first. But overall, the findings highlight how each of the 3 countries, they developed very different pathways. Although they all started with a polycentric structure, they all developed different pathways toward re-centralization of fisheries. And this re-centralization, it takes place through a systematic reduction in the power of lower level decision centers in Kenya due to unclear rules, dysfunctional overlaps, a forceful crackdown on illegal fishing in Tanzania, and a complete demolishment of lower level decision centers in Uganda, and also through the use of the Ugandan People's Defense Force in Uganda. So similarity across all 3 countries is that there is either a partial reduction or a complete reduction in the functions of lower level decision centers. So in totality, these findings illustrate how power dynamics can shift a polycentric system into a more monocentric system, which can compromise the long-term sustainability of the fisheries. So starting with Kenya for power by design. So power by design, to recall, it's the power that's written in legislation, institutions, rules, and incentives. So for attribute 1, this is, as I said before, this is revealed through document analysis. So for this, I included the Fisheries Act of 2016 and BMU guidelines. And both these documents show that power is distributed at different levels as well as jurisdictions. So there is the Kenyan Fisheries Service, there are county governments, there's BMUs, there are authorized fisheries officers, There's an interagency monitoring, control, and surveillance unit with 16 different agencies across different levels. So all of these are present, a variety of institutions as well as decision centers across different levels and jurisdictions. For attribute 2, I found that the documents do not have a lot of, they do not have any scope actually for experimentation, but they have very broad discretionary powers to prosecute fishers, to search, seize, and arrest even without a warrant, just based on suspicion of an offense. And they can use force to exercise their power. So instead of incentivizing experimentation and problem solving, these rules actually authorize the use of force to enforce regulations, which again depict this very top-down approach to manage fisheries. With regard to cross-level linkages in Kenya, there is the interagency monitoring, control, and surveillance unit that I mentioned that includes different agencies and jurisdictions. And with regard to accountability, I found that the state is authorized to intervene for resolving conflicts between the county and state. So it's a lot of downward accountability, not much of upward accountability. And this is just all on paper. So we've not yet spoken about how it actually plays out in practice. Tanzania was again similar to Kenya. Here I included the Fisheries Act of 2003 and BMU guidelines. So again, similar to Kenya, they distribute different roles and responsibilities across the different levels of the government, and they can develop priorities for fisheries management to respond to local challenges. And with regard to attribute 2, again, similar to Kenya, fisheries officers have broad discretionary powers to prosecute fishers, search, seize, and arrest without a warrant, just based on suspicion. And again, with regard to accountability and conflict resolution, the state fisheries director can intervene in cases of conflict between local authorities. So again, upward accountability, but not downward accountability. Uganda, things become very different over here. I included the Fish Act of 2000 and the 2015 National BMU guidelines, but these guidelines had not yet been implemented when I was doing fieldwork here. So there aren't really a variety of institutions, although the Act established the Ministry of Fisheries, the Chief Fisheries Officer, different authorized officers, and BMUs. In 2015, the BMUs were disbanded and fisheries officers were suspended, and the Ugandan People's Defense Force started managing fisheries. But there were no documents, rules, or policies that demarcate the authority of the Ugandan People's Defense Force or the scope of the powers of the People's Defense Force. So compared to Kenya and Uganda, Uganda definitely has fewer decision centers, and all of them are concentrated at the center. With regard to attribute 2, in Uganda, the officers had very ill-defined, vague, and discretionary powers for providing licensing, for arresting people on the suspicion of having committed an offense, for seizing fish and illegal gear, and for prosecuting fishers. There were no opportunities for decision centers to interact with each other, so cross-level linkages are absent. And there's no downward or upward accountability at all. So here the Ugandan People's Defense Force was managing the fisheries when I was conducting fieldwork, and any remnant of a polycentric system had been dismantled by the state. And with all the decision centers concentrated at the center, because all the local level fisheries officers had been suspended at that time. So moving on to pragmatic power, which is the discretion that officers have in implementing the rules in use. So as I mentioned before, it's manifested through false compliance, feigned ignorance, tokenistic behavior, and non-decision making. So it helps to explain why someone might not want to implement rules or any policies that might be unpopular. So with regard to Kenya, pragmatic power reveals that even though in the rules and regulations and policies, officers have different kinds of power, they only choose to pursue the tool of seizing and burning illegal gears. So they deploy only one management tool to reduce illegal and overfishing. And this is across officers from both decision centers, from the local as well as the central government. With regard to experimentation, cross-level linkages, and accountability and conflict resolution, I didn't find any evidence when I conducted field work. Instead, what I found was there are these norms of corruption which are endemic throughout the system that hinder the possibility of experimentation. So illegal fishing continues in exchange for bribes, and these kinds of practices are emblematic of power relations where officers have the power to demand bribes and fishers have little power to avoid paying the bribes, because the other option is maybe risk going to court or risk going to jail, which is a very lengthy process because you're going to lose your livelihood. So corruption sustains those networks between fishers and the police overall. And then with regard to accountability and conflict resolution, uh, although in theory those linkages are present, in practice they are not present because there is confusion about who has responsibilities to license the fishers. So the Fisheries Act of 2016 authorizes the state to license industrial fishers and the county to license artisanal fishers, but both the state and the county continue licensing industrial fishers. So there's double licensing going on where fishers have to pay both the county and the state government. And state officers conjecture that this kind of double licensing is a deliberate misinterpretation of the law by the county government to gain funds and ownership of the fisheries. And I'll talk more about this when I show some interview quotes. With regard to Tanzania, again, very similar to Kenya, where force is the primary tool of choice encouraged by the state government through Operation Sangara. So there aren't a variety of institutions, but both state and local governments use force. With regard to experimentation, cross-level linkages, accountability, and conflict resolution, all of these are inactive. Here, the issue is less of double licensing as in Kenya, but more of monitoring, control, and surveillance. So the county government has twin objectives of conducting monitoring operations as well as collecting revenue. And both these operations are in conflict with each other, because if you're conducting monitoring, that means your revenue reduces from the fisheries. So the county prefers to collect revenue rather than conduct monitoring. So since the county prioritizes revenue collection, the state is now conducting monitoring and enforcement operations, which means that this has paved the way for the state agencies to take over and minimize the functions of lower level decision centers. And they do that without coordinating or informing the county government, which also leads to a lot of conflict between these two government levels. And then finally, in Uganda, none of these attributes or enabling conditions were present because all of the lower level decision centers had been disbanded. And the Ugandan People's Defense Force, which is not a formal actor, is actually included in managing fisheries. So it's under a single authoritative decision-making center, which functions again in a very top-down manner. So overall, all three countries use a coercive and authoritative approach to management. While at that time, my evidence suggested that that has been ineffective in reducing fishing illegalities, and I'll be interested to hear from you all whether things have changed, if anyone is doing research on these topics, and if you all have that knowledge. But with regard to power, these kinds of coercive approaches also reinforce the asymmetric power relations between fishers and officers. So these findings illustrate how the tendency to pursue authoritarian strategies to reduce illegal fishing across all three countries occurs in polycentric systems, which can turn the polycentric system of fisheries into a monocentric system. In Kenya, the evidence suggested that lower level authorities are resisting the state government's incursion in their jurisdiction through double licensing, But that kind of resistance was not seen in Tanzania, where the state had taken over the county government's function of monitoring and enforcement operations. So overall, this exercise of pragmatic power results in a weak or non-functional cross-level linkages where both higher and lower levels of government do not take each other into account. So such concentration of power at the center and the exclusion of these lower level decision centers comes with this increased decentralization, which can weaken the capacity to craft institutions that are better adapted to local concerns, to the concerns of fishers, and can also respond to environmental changes. So some quotes uh, for y'all. So with regard to attribute one, lack of variety of institutions and decision centers across multiple levels. So I mentioned that force is a primary tool of choice. So this is one quote where a senior fisheries officer said, "We want illegal fishing to be really painful so that they never do it again." Another one said in Uganda, when the Ugandan People's Defense Force disbanded the BMUs were a community venture. Then the soldiers came. They organized us, forced us, mobilized us into attending a meeting. So again, the use of force. With regard to norms of corruption that hinder the possibility of experimentation, a Fisher said that people have devised means of survival in the industry where each fish trader or fisherman has a connection with the authorities who can rescue them in case they're arrested for illegal activity. So this shows the networks between the fishers and the fisheries officers that are supported by corruption. Another fisher said the BMU cannot dare to stop me from fishing illegally when the professionally trained boss, that is my fisheries officer, has allowed me to fish. With regard to cross-level linkages, an officer in Tanzania said, they, the ministry, want to be in charge of the fisheries sector, but we are the ones who are working at the grassroots. Maybe because they're at the top, they may think there is no need to cooperate with us. So this shows the absence of cross-level linkages. Another officer said that sometimes, this is from a state fisheries officer, when we go to districts for enforcing a law, we get complaints from the district that we went without informing them. So this tells us that those cross-level linkages for information sharing are inactive. With regard to accountability and conflict resolution, a state fisheries officer said, the local government is not accountable to me. I am not their boss. They're accountable to the executive director, and I am accountable to the central government. In my view, if anything goes wrong, who is accountable? Are you going to charge the local government or the central government? And then finally, moving on to framing power. So for all three countries, none of the attributes and enabling conditions were present. So framing power illustrates how actors construct issues, create and influence discourse across centers to benefit their agenda and to avoid formal rules and regulation. So state officials in Kenya and Tanzania, they justified their presence at the county level as necessary to compensate for the county's lack of capacity. So this was something that I heard very often. They said that counties don't have resources, they don't have the ability, they don't have enough people to conduct enforcement operations. So they said that just because a county doesn't have resources, it's okay, it's necessary to re-centralize fisheries, and not just fisheries, but also other natural resources management functions as well. Other scholars have also found similar examples of the state deploying these kinds of frames of local authorities' lack of capacity to halt power sharing between the central and local government. So this kind of framing power indicates the state's preference to reduce the functions of lower level decision centers for moving toward re-centralization instead of sharing responsibilities, which was at the heart of the design of co-management. So some quotes over here. Co-management is a government venture to involve fishers. Co-management was framed as telling fishers to do this and fishers to do that, but it didn't ask what fishers want. So again, a very top-down approach. With regard to lack of experimentation, cross-level linkages, accountability, and conflict resolution. So here I found an actor to be involved that I didn't anticipate when I was doing fieldwork. These are the local politicians and the members of parliament for whom it's important to protect the vote base, the fishers. And they don't like it when fishers are fined or they are harassed or they're asked for bribes or put in jail for illegal fishing. So one interviewee said, if you insist on continuing to do your work, the member of parliament will threaten you to move out of the district. And when he comes and sits with your director, he'll fabricate anything. He'll say, yes, remove that person from my district. He's doing this to my fishermen. He's doing that. Your boss knows the truth, but he looks at the power the MP has and decides to transfer you. And when you're transferred, you're demoralized, and then the illegalities will continue. So political interference is a big challenge. So overall, this was from a state fisheries officer in Kenya. All of the fisheries officers at the state argued for not devolving fisheries or any other kind of natural resource management any further, but to re-centralize it under the central government. So moving toward the end, so this research sought to examine power dynamics in Lake Victoria's fisheries, and the analysis reveals a pattern where power by design creates a polycentric structure, at least in Kenya and Tanzania, that could have provided opportunities for power sharing between decision centers, but both pragmatic and framing power, they consolidate power and authority in the central government. There are key differences in all three countries. In Kenya, it has been very slow and gradual with resistance from lower level authorities. It's been more open in Tanzania with Operation Sangara and with state officers taking over local functions. And it happened very suddenly in Uganda with the disbanding of lower level institutions. So both pragmatic and framing power, they erode power away from lower level authorities by either taking over their functions or completely dismantling them. So there's really not a genuine interest to share power among decision centers. Cross-level linkages are deliberately non-functional, or they have high transaction costs for information sharing, which also lead to resentment and conflicts between the state and the county fisheries officers. And in the absence of cross-level linkages, there's no information sharing, very little accountability, no conflict resolution. And in combination, these factors, they end up concentrating power at the center, resulting in maladaptive outcomes for Lake Victoria's fisheries. So a little bit of discussion. So power by design, there is a polycentric structure in Kenya and Tanzania that legitimizes participation of actors across different levels and jurisdictions. The state definitely wields more power over lower level decision centers in Kenya and Tanzania, depicting the shift toward re-centralization. And in Uganda, this does not even exist, where any remnant of polycentric structure has been dismantled by the state. With regard to pragmatic power, there are perverse incentives to sustain corruption, which do not provide a lot of scope for experimentation. And there have been other studies that have found that when there are overlaps between decision centers, it can spur collective action. But in this case, the overlaps do not really support collective action because, at least in Kenya, it's more about resisting the incursion of the state who also wants to do double licensing. At least in Kenya, there is some resistance. In Tanzania, the state has taken over the monitoring operations, and this again results in dysfunctionality in the system. And finally, with framing power, there have been examples in other parts of the world with states arguing that lower levels don't have the capacity, so it's fine to take over the functions. So to conclude, oops, it's not moving forward. So just studying the structure of a polycentric system, it's insufficient for addressing complex multi-scale problems, and we need to identify the functional aspects of polycentric systems. So in this case, this exercise of pragmatic power through corruption, misinterpretation of rules, non-functional cross-level linkages, a disregard for rules and institutional gaps. They constrain the performance of the polycentric systems. And all three countries respond by increasing the state's oversight for addressing such problem of a complex and a multi-scale nature. And these findings are also applicable beyond Lake Victoria's fisheries, especially in places with high levels of corruption, where power sharing mechanisms are absent or not or dysfunctional. So what can be done about this? So having well-designed rules with participation of all decision centers, including fishers, can provide incentives for problem solving, and especially to make functional cross-level linkages to enhance information sharing, accountability, and conflict reducing mechanisms. So questions for future research, if anyone here is interested in pursuing this line of study. So Elizabeth Baldwin et al., they've done some research on polycentric systems in Kenya, and they focused on small scale irrigation, and they found that polycentricity appeared to work well in that context. So a research question could be how and why different resource systems under the same regime perform differently. Other questions can include what are other kinds of patterns in less functional or dysfunctional polycentric systems? Under what conditions can overlaps improve the governance? In my fieldwork, I found that overlaps were not conducive for collective action, but it can work the other way as well. So at what levels of governance can overlaps improve functionality, and what kind of functions are more suited to overlaps between different decision centers? So I'll end over there. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and we can open it up for discussion and Q&A for the next 15-20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Praneeta. That was an excellent presentation. And I've checked in the chat. As of now, we do not have questions, but maybe I might start off with a number of with one or two questions. Maybe my first question is, if you are looking at your study and you were referring constantly to the state, it would be interesting to know if you also, as part of your study, looked at the nature of the state itself, maybe especially when it comes to the colonial and post-colonial states, on how some of these issues, you would see that it's almost like continuity, maybe with little or no change in terms of how the state perceived itself, despite being now an independent state, and now from colonial to post-colonial. But what is the state? The construct of the state itself might also have implications in terms of that. And then the second question that I wanted to understand is that you mentioned that co-management was introduced across the three countries at more or less the same time. But maybe just an understanding of whose idea, who sort of helped to come up with this particular idea of co-management, because I'm assuming that I worked on co-management in forestry elsewhere, and you would see that sometimes it's an agenda which is set from outside, and then the states accept it maybe as a way of accessing some of the resources, but they do not buy into the logic and idea behind co-management itself. So it would be interesting for you to also cover something on that. I have more questions, but I want to give others a chance to ask questions as well. Oh, yeah, now, I don't know. Okay, we'll ask some participants have started adding questions. So please do add questions in the chat, and then you respond to these two, and then we'll bring in another set of questions. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Evaristo. So those are two, so both these ideas were at the back of my head. So I come from India, and I very well understand how the state is an extension of the colonial government. And what was interesting to me is I didn't find any differences actually. For me, conducting fieldwork, like this was my first time also being in these three countries. It was very similar to India. So it was easy for me to understand the norms and get around. And I could understand and see and observe how the state is an extension of these colonial institutions in the past and the kind of power that they wield. And it's just been propped up where elites are now in, positions of power rather than the actual democratic ideals that were for many of these states post-independence. So that I think has not changed, and that kind of extension of this very a paternal state who thinks that they know better, they know what is best for the people at the local level, at the grassroots level, or for the fishers. And these are again ideas that would keep coming in the interviews, where they would say that, oh, the fishers don't know anything, they don't understand how to fish. And that's not true, right? These people are at the local level, they understand the water system, they understand those dynamics. But there was this huge mismatch between what fishers would say, what the county officers would say, and the kind of paternalistic attitude of the state of fisheries officers. And one of them actually said, I understand that fishers have rights, human rights are being abused in this kind of a crackdown, but what can you do when the problem is so bad? So again, taking that very forceful, top down, punitive, coercive approach rather than talking with people in order to resolve these issues. And with regard to co-management, Evaristo, you're perfectly right, right? Like these ideas formulated in some part of Europe, especially with regard to fisheries, and then implemented in Lake Victoria's fisheries. And again, this has been Lake Victoria's fisheries, all of these ideas about how to manage fisheries of Lake Victoria's have always come from the European context or the Euro-American context. It's not really, at least until now, we've not seen any ideas that have come locally simply because of the power the external authorities also hold, right? Like, where does funding for co-management come from? Initially, co-management was funded by authorities from Europe. Lake Victoria's Fisheries Organization, at least at the time that I was conducting field work, again, it was being funded by external authorities from Europe. And this is one of the research questions that we'd included in the paper. What's the role of these external funding organizations and the kinds of agendas they have, and the power dynamics between them and the state government, as well as the county fisheries officers and fishers, to then pursue their own different, to pursue fishing. And also, I think I didn't go into this. What I learned during field work, so this was illegal fishing is with regard to this fish called Nile perch. And the Nile perch isn't even a native fish. It was introduced by the British colonial government as game for the fishers, and it completely took over the ecosystem. And the fish is in high demand in Europe, it's in high demand in South America, it's in high demand in the Middle East. It's not used for local consumption, but the state wants to preserve the population of Nile perch at sustainable levels so that it can bring in the valuable foreign exchange for them. So again, something that was meant for just a recreational effort for the colonial officers that was posted there has now become an issue of livelihoods for the fishers in this particular region. So yes, you're completely right. And I actually just found a paper where someone had been studying, I think, from 1920s to 1960s and mapping the evolution of the colonial governments and its impact on Lake Victoria's fisheries, which unfortunately continues even today. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think I have a second set of questions. The first one coming from Grace. Grace, do you want to unmute and ask the question?
Yes, I can go ahead and ask. So in the framing power, you mentioned that the government keeps mentioning that the locals don't have the capacity to enforce governance. But then when you were talking also, I picked, or maybe I missed it, that you were talking about the state and the lower level being the county. So I was just wondering, are there no cooperatives for the fishermen? Because I would think that the governance can also be enforced through the cooperatives that the fishermen are involved in. So was it related to the framework or not? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Grace, for that question. So With regard to cooperatives, these are the co-management units, the beach management units that include both the fishers as well as representation from government officers. And I didn't go too much into this during the talk because of time constraints, but there are power dynamics, asymmetric power dynamics, even between the county fisheries officers and the fishers. So just as there are asymmetries between the higher level, the state fisheries officers and county fisheries officers, it's similar even at the lower level. Although it seemed like the county fisheries officers, to some degree, were a little more sympathetic to the fishers. But it was similar. Again, county fisheries officers, even though they showed some sympathy for the livelihoods of fishers, it was still all about we need to end illegal fishing. Some of them did mention that we need to work with fishers and understand their concerns and what is driving. And some of them said that, well, the problem is also not even illegal fishing. It's actually the pollution that is bringing down the number of fish in the lake. And it's easy to blame fishers because it's a scapegoat just sitting over there. So you can push the blame on someone else. So I did include the BMUs in the study as well. So yeah.
Thank you for that. And I'll try to maybe put all the other remaining comments since I'm watching time as well. I think Wadiba maybe is just acknowledging that an interesting, well-presented problem. So I think this one is a comment. And then also I take the next one is also a comment. The irrigation systems work because they work most inputs, including labor and land, is by the farmer. So this is just a comment. The next one is a question. He says, have you seen a difference in the power dynamics with traditional fish farming and cage fish farming? Since we almost coming towards the end, I will also maybe add one or two other questions as well. I liked your recommendations when you're looking at the way forward. And one of the things you mentioned is well-designed rules. I think when you think of Ostrom as well, she speaks a lot on the well-designed rules. But one of the sort of extensions that has been coming from the others is that it's not just about the design of the rules, it's the political economy of the rules, because you can have well-crafted rules, but when it comes to enforcement, compliance, and even adjudication, that then does not take place. If you could also reflect on that. And maybe the last part, I would also want you to comment on. You were raising issues of gender when you're talking about fisheries. I know you mentioned gender. But it would be interesting to see in terms of the power dynamics that we have within the fisheries sector, what were sort of these multiple, even contested power dynamics, and even where you try to link maybe with Scott, where he speaks of even weapons of the weak, so that no one is absolutely powerful or powerless, but each person or individual do have their own powers. And how did this play out within the context of Lake Victoria? Thanks, and back to you.
Oh, thank you, Evaristo, for that question. So I think I'll be able to link weapons of the week to the question on traditional fish farming and cage fish farming. So there were interviews with some people who have started moving into aquaculture and start cage fish farming, and we found that these are more likely to be wealthier fishers who have more capital in order to invest in cage fish farming. And we've not yet analyzed those interviews, and I don't think I'll analyze them now since it's been a very long time. But from what I remember is that it was because it's already wealthy people who are investing in cage fish farming, the access routes for traditional fishers was being hampered because these cages are huge. They take up quite amount of space in the water. So fishers' routes to the lake was being obstructed. And it was also sort of creating private property within the water body. Also, when you do cage fish farming, you're concentrating a lot of nutrients in one place, right? Because you're adding food as well as different medicines for these fishes. So the fish from the wild fish in the lake would start moving to the place where the food source is concentrated. So this would create a lot of work for the fishers, the traditional fishers, because now they have to follow the fish. So sometimes out of resentment or anger to deploy weapons of the weak concept, they would sometimes cut off the cage and release the fish into the water. So now you have a situation where caged fish are going to be breeding with the wild fish. And I don't know that much of genetics and science to understand, what consequences that can lead to. But these were some scenarios that were happening with regard to the power dynamics between traditional fish farming and cage fish farming. I also learned that China is investing sufficient lot of funds for cage fish farming and aquaculture. While I was in Kenya Marine Fisheries Institute, I came across a report, an environmental impact assessment report of cage fish farming, and the entire report was about how it's very important for food security for Kenya, and it has to be pursued at all costs, even if it means reducing the dependence on traditional fishing in Lake Victoria. So I don't know if that has happened since I've not followed what came out of that report. But this was again back in 2018, so it's been 7 to 8 years since then. So I hope that answers your question. Evaristo, with regard to your question about well-designed rules and the larger political economy, and this is something that we know, right? If rules are not going to work, if the larger system does not support the development, the enforcement, as well as the ownership of the people who are developing those rules, it's going to be at the same situation as we are seeing today, where the state will continue holding power without allowing the fishers to exercise their rights and responsibilities. Fiona Noonan has written a paper on the political economy of Lake Victoria's fisheries, where she dives into this kind of a question about what's the point of co-management if the larger system still continues to operate in this paternalistic way, where it's all about concentrating power at the center rather than distributing power more equitably within the system. And again, it's not been done before, so we don't know to what extent fisheries officers will also, there's going to be a lot of resistance, what I see from fisheries officers, to let go of the power that they have in order to allow fishers to build their own capacities to undertake fishing, as in the way Grace mentioned, through cooperatives. I've seen some recent research come out by Jeffrey says, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Jeffrey Seskea, I think, who's been working on Uganda's fisheries, and even they've been finding, they've been able to validate my research as well. So I don't think things have changed in the past 7 to 8 years, other than just continuation of these asymmetric power dynamics across all three levels of the government.
Thank you very much. We actually on top of the hour, and what we will also do, maybe we will request you to also share a PDF of your presentation, so that we may share, when we are sharing the link of this recording, we also share with a PDF of your presentation. Okay. I think on behalf of Kofi and Grace, I think I would want to thank you for an excellent presentation, and I think all the colleagues online also enjoyed your presentation. So thank you very much for sharing such rich insights. And when you share, if you also have published papers which are available for sharing, please do share them as well. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And also just Praneeta, to mention that we might take a few extracts from this and also edit as part of the Commons Week, which we will also rerun during the December season as well. So thank you very much for this.
All right. Thank you, Evaristo. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Kofi. And I'll share the PDF and the papers with you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.